Okay, next on our agenda is the ARLACCHI report on a new strategy for Afghanistan. And of course, I'll begin with the rapporteur. He has 4 minutes, Mr. ARLACCHI.
Mr. President, Lady Ashton, dear colleagues, the report we consider today has been approved virtually unanimously by the Committee on Foreign Affairs of this Parliament. It is the result of 1 year work by a team I led, and it is based on extensive consultations in Kabul and Brussels. This report is an attempt to explain a paradox. Why has so little been achieved in Afghanistan in spite of 9 years of international involvement? Since 2001, military operations inside that country cost more than €300 billion and several thousand human lives. And at least another €40 billion have been spent on the civilian side, in total more than 30 times the current Afghan GDP. In spite of this huge effort, Afghanistan is still the #1 producer of narcotic drugs. It is still one of the poorest countries in the world, where for the majority of the Afghan population life is short, brutal and nasty, as it was in our continent 5 centuries ago. Maternal mortality alone makes in Afghanistan more victims than the war, over 20,000 a year against 2,300. The answer to this paradox is not simple. The opium problem and the strength of the insurgency must be taken into account, along with the belief or the illusion of a quick military victory that dominated the early years of international presence. Moreover, the legitimacy of the central government has been overestimated, as well as the efficiency of the international aid for the reconstruction of the country. This report does not try to simplify all this matter. It accepts the challenge in its full dimension. And this document is an attempt to suggest new directions for our policies. The report approaches the subject from a European standpoint. It means that the Afghan crisis is considered from an angle that does not simply mirror the American perspective on it. European values and principles matter. They influence the way the Afghan problem is seen by European citizens, and they don't believe in a military solution. In principle, because more than 65 years ago we abandoned the idea that war and occupation of foreign lands is a good one. Today's EU is built on aversion to war, and this report reflects this feeling. On the specific issue of Afghanistan, EU citizens strongly support a civilian approach as an alternative to the use of force. Our approach is not naive. It is not, it has been said, Venus' softness against Mars' strength. It is instead the power of reason and human solidarity applied to a crisis like the Afghan one that cannot be faced with a simplistic solution and mentality. This report proposes a strategy that does not exclude a limited use of coercive means. Security of the people of Afghanistan from terrorist and criminal attacks is a prerequisite for development. And this Parliament believes that the combination of peacekeeping interventions, multilateral diplomacy, domestic peace negotiations, effective poverty reduction measures, establishment of democratic institutions and the protection of women's rights are the pillars of a new winning strategy, in Afghanistan like elsewhere. And I hope the strategy that is outlined here will be implemented carefully by the EU system. And I take the opportunity to invite Mrs. Ashton to join the Parliament in this endeavour. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. ARLACCHI. Now, Mrs. Ashton, to come back on the rapporteur's intervention.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. I want to begin by honouring the memory of Ryszard Holbrooke, a dedicated diplomat, a champion of peace, and a man I was proud to call my friend. I want to pay tribute to the honourable member, Mr. ARLACCHI, for the comprehensive report and for work that I know he has done, which has provoked a rich debate in this Parliament over the last few months. I, for my part, look forward to working very much with him and other colleagues in Parliament in the months ahead as we enter what I would describe as a crucial phase in our engagement in Afghanistan. As Mr Arlacchi said, the problems that face Afghanistan, in a sense, concern all of us. Violent extremism extends beyond the region. Drugs grown and produced in Afghanistan find their way to the streets of Europe. Our engagement is spurred by the need to prevent Afghanistan from becoming a safe haven for terrorism and criminal activities. But it is equally important that we promote a better, more secure and prosperous future for the people of Afghanistan. Without that, there will not be a solution. In response to these challenges, I want to begin by saying that, as I have said many times in other places, that the European Union is in Afghanistan for the long term. We have an assistance programme up to 2013 and I am sure beyond, and we have now increased the baseline of our assistance to €200 million per annum, which is up from €150 million per annum previously. With that funding, we are able to continue to support health and social welfare, as well as governance and the rule of law. And despite the fact that security concerns are in the forefront of all our minds, I believe we have had some noticeable success in key social sectors. I have mentioned in this House before the health sector, where, for example, 80% of the country now has some form of access to primary health care, compared with less than 10% in 2001. It is also true that health indicators in Afghanistan are still amongst the worst in the world, so we have a long way to go. That said, we know from the UN figures that compared with 2001, 40,000 fewer babies are dying each year in Afghanistan, and that is due to considerably improved prenatal care. We also continue to channel as much of our assistance as possible through the Afghan government structures to ensure that we get Afghani leadership of the reform process. About 50% of our assistance goes either through national programmes or through trust funds that directly support the Afghan government. This is good for donor coordination, good for building local capacity and good for reinforcing Afghani ownership. And it sets a good example for many other donors too. But there is always room for improving international coordination. We need to do more and we need to do it better. But looking at what the European Union does, I think we have made real progress, significantly enhanced by the arrival of our new EU Special Representative, Head of Delegation, Vigaudas Ušackas, who arrived in Afghanistan in April. Our political messaging is more coherent and we are enhancing our coordination of our development efforts within the EU through the Action Plan for Afghanistan and Pakistan that was approved in October last year by the Council of Ministers. The Action Plan brings the instruments that we are deploying collectively and by individual Member States in line with our policy priorities, especially those arising from the Kabul conference which I attended in July. Aligning our efforts and our approach is a key aspect of the plan. It identifies areas where we, as the European Union, believe our action will be most effective. Indeed, European Union development ministers under my chairmanship were discussing precisely these issues last week in Brussels. And that brings me, in a sense, to the key message I want to give today, namely that the implementation of our existing strategies needs to be the priority. The strategic framework is in place in both the military and the civilian spheres. Together with both presidents, I participated in the ISAF meeting in Lisbon last month, where the transfer of security responsibility under the NATO transition plan has been agreed. I have met with General David Petraeus 3 times in recent months, and while much remains to be done, I am confident that the current strategy is beginning to have a real impact. And on the civilian side, we had the successful Kabul conference. The Afghan government is to be applauded for the organisation and the focus of the event in July. It was not the usual roll call of requests and donor pledges. Rather, the agenda focused on how best to prioritise our existing resources and commitments, channelling our efforts into agreed national programmes that have been developed by the Afghanis themselves. These national priority programmes pave the way for transition across a range of different sectors, and we need now to support them, which is precisely what our action plan is doing. We all know that there can be no sustainable military exit from Afghanistan without a civilian framework for stability that can keep the country together. More effective state institutions, better governance, access to basic services, justice and the rule of law are just as important as hard security. We will thus reinforce our efforts to strengthen Afghan capacity and will work with the Afghan government to foster effective and accountable state institutions, especially at the sub-national level. Indeed, in all the areas we are engaged in, rural development, law enforcement, border management or tackling the narcotics trade, we will work to build up local Afghan institutions, putting the emphasis on promoting the rule of law and governance and on fighting corruption. And on the question of Afghan institutions, I want to end with a word on Afghan undertakings. Our efforts on development will only become sustainable once the Afghan government becomes more accountable and inclusive. We need to encourage them to take such a long-term view. At present, half the human capacity in the country is marginalised, and yet we have seen from other examples in the world that the engagement of women in the governance and development processes is fundamental. I was struck by this untapped potential when I met with women's groups in Kabul last July. This will remain a key aspect of our engagement in Afghanistan, be it in the political support to women MPs in the new Afghan Parliament or through our support to women's participation in local development projects, such as the widely recognised National Solidarity Programme, which we have been funding through the World Bank since 2002. Honourable members, as I close, I am grateful, I say again, to the Honourable Member Mr Arlacchi for highlighting so many important issues in this report. I believe it comes at a really opportune moment, with so much at stake to both in our military and our civilian commitments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to Mr Goerens for the Development Committee for a minute and a half. Thank you very much, Madam President. Afghanistan doesn't have much choice left. First of all, the NATO forces are announcing their withdrawal from a country where they've guaranteed security. Secondly, the return to the pre-2000 situation isn't an option. The terrorists would expose the country to a showdown with foreign armies. Thirdly, and can't speak about moderate Taliban because nobody can say what a moderate Taliban is. Ask Afghan women who have just found a bit of freedom. Fourthly, there's the option of consolidating what's been achieved and a fight for more democracy and development. Karzai, who wants to go for this option, is an obstacle in himself, but that appears to be the only option available. Now, I move to the speakers for the groups, and I'll start with Mr. Kasoulides for 2 minutes.
Merci, Madam President. Our key position in this report is the counter-insurgency strategy and the EU action plan, and I thank Mr Arlacchi for understanding this. This strategy must be given time to work according to the timetable set by President Obama, with 2014 as the deadline for the complete Afghanization of military and police operations. Certainly the end stage will be political, with an agreement reached through negotiations by all Afghani sides in the conflict. The contacts with the Taliban is an Afghani affair, but this should begin when the insurgents cease to feel in a position of strength. The aid distribution and the use of private contractors needs to be rethought so that it is directed to the benefit of the local population and certainly without paying protection money to local insurgents for the supply routes. On narcotics, equal importance should be accorded in parallel with security for the sake of lives of the European youth. We are strongly against paragraph 71 that condemns the use of drones, which is an integral part of the counterinsurgency strategy. What the European soldiers in the field are going to think if the European Parliament condemns such an effective weapon in their fight against insurgency, I urge colleagues to vote against the third part of paragraph 71. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, Mr. Neuser, for 2 minutes.
Frau Präsidentin.
Madam President, Lady Ashton, the European Union is working in a number of missions on the basis of UN Security Council resolutions. Too many EU troops have lost their young lives in Afghanistan. A lot have been injured or are suffering or are struggling with the strain of deployment. Thousands of civilian helpers from Europe are risking their lives daily to try to help Afghanistan towards a better future. All of them and all of us have to really see that we get sustainable success from our massive deployment in Europe and for as long as the military operations continue. Now, what is to get better and what new goals are there in the new EU Afghanistan strategy? We need better efforts for civilian reconstruction. We need to retrain the police and the judiciary in Afghanistan. We know that there will be no military solution, and as such, we therefore have to work towards enhancing the efforts of a political solution through the EU Common Foreign Security Policy. The integration process using and tapping into the moderate Taliban has to be driven forward. We also need to do something concrete at the regional level to try to stabilize the situation. Now, part of that is really focusing on drug cultivation and the drugs trade. Our strategy has got some useful proposals. We're calling for the Afghani government to state its will to remove corruption from government. But the new EU strategy can only be a success if it does not just remain on paper, but is actually active and involves the neighbouring states. Lady Ashton, we have hope in you. We are expecting things from you, and you have our utmost support.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mr. VAJGL for 2 minutes.
Gospa predsedujoča, spoštovana.
Madam President, Lady Ashton, thank you for recognizing Ambassador Holbrooke. It's correct that we're thinking of him today and that we owe him his thanks for what he has done. We all have a problem in Afghanistan which in another period could have been dealt with rather quickly by other means. Today we can see that there is no military solution. Whilst we're searching for other ways, there are new victims every day, civilians and those in uniform. This report produced by Mr. ARLACCHI maps out these reports. These reports opens up the misuse of humanitarian aid via illusions of warlords and the drugs trade. The presence of Al-Qaeda isn't the entire problem. The war is seeping into neighbouring states. The report points out that the correct long-term solutions in Afghanistan will improve human rights, the situation of women and human. These can only be achieved by stronger cooperation between the Afghan authorities, civil society and religious institutions. And in order to build up a state built on their own traditions. Madam President, this report is an important attempt to point up the main problems and the ways forward for Afghanistan. This report encourages us to have a bold policy in Afghanistan. Mrs. KIIL-NIELSEN.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Baroness Ashton. First of all, I'd like to thank Mr. ARLACCHI for his constructive approach to our work together. This report proposes a very honest and fair adjustment of the shortcomings of international intervention in Afghanistan since 2001. We've heard the key message. There is no military solution here. War is very costly in human lives, also for soldiers and within the population. All we're doing is increasing the strength of the Taliban. So the solution has to be political. What do they want, the Afghan people? They want investment in their country. They want help for good governance. They want the reconstruction of a good judicial system. Problems of fundamental rights and women's rights are still persistent. The recent report of the UN mission in Afghanistan reveals the government's incapacity to properly protect the rights of women and children. As long as women and children are subject to damaging practices, degrading practices that deprive them of their rights, real sustainable progress cannot be done in Afghanistan. In order to guarantee the rights of Afghan women, we have to not just have legal guarantees and constitutional guarantees on paper, but more importantly, we need the implementation which is swift and adequate of those rights. The National Court only has little influence in the country. Most of the power is concentrated in the hands of President Karzai, and if it's not too late, we need solid support to strengthen the rule of law and democracy, and that's why the European Union should come to help different institutions and the Parliament that has just been installed.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Mr. Stevenson for 2 minutes.
For the past year, I've served as personal representative of the Chairman in Office of the OSCE, Kazakhstan, preparing a detailed report on the key environmental issues affecting Central Asia. I've sent you a copy of my report, Baroness Ashton. One of the key issues which affect the whole of Central Asia is, of course, the question of transboundary water utilisation. As you know, there is great and constant tension between the upstream and downstream nations in Central Asia involving water use. But one aspect of this problem emerged during the course of my investigation that has, I think, been missed by many decision makers in the West. The mainstay of the Afghan economy is agriculture, and any rebuilding of the economy in a post-conflict Afghanistan will mean massive investment in agriculture, encouraging, for example, farmers to switch from growing heroin poppies to growing pomegranates. That, in turn, will mean a huge additional utilisation of already scarce water resources. In other words, by helping to resolve the current conflict in Afghanistan, we could inadvertently create a series of mini-Afghanistans downstream as acute water shortages are exacerbated. We must take care to ensure that any new irrigation schemes are properly designed with concrete lined channels and reservoirs, with droplet irrigation systems similar to those used by farmers in Spain. And in addition, any major energy projects involving hydroelectric power plants must be carefully designed and constructed to ensure that they do not create any disadvantage for downstream water users in neighbouring countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stevenson. The next speaker is Mr. Higgins for 1 minute.
Madam President, the United States and NATO-led war in Afghanistan is an unmitigated disaster for the Afghan people, an estimated 30,000 of whom killed last year alone, and for also a disaster for the young men and women forced to join and fight there in the armies of NATO and the United States, perhaps 500 killed already this year. Now, after 9 years, as the ARLACCHI report makes very clear, The economic and social situation in Afghanistan is extremely dire. The number of people living in poverty has increased dramatically. What a scandal, considering that $300 billion has been obscenely wasted in weapons of mass destruction, in war, and lost in corruption over that time. The US invasion of Afghanistan was undertaken not to advance the interests of the Afghan people, but the geostrategic interests of the United States in Central Asia, which of course is rich in energy, oil and gas. Foreign armies must be withdrawn. Such wealth as exists in Afghanistan should be taken from the hands of the Karzai government and corrupt landlords and warlords and put democratically in the hands of organisations of peasants, workers and the poor to really utilise those resources and develop them for the benefit of the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Higgins. Now, Mr. Belder, for 1 minute. Thank you, Madam President. As rapporteur for the position of the EU on Iran, I'm interested in connection with the report when it comes to the role of Iran. Iran has influence on Afghanistan. That's slightly left out of the report. The question is, how does the EU assess the actual influence of Iran, and what are the political consequences that we draw from this? So, I would have 3 specific questions to the rapporteur, and the High Representative, I'm sure, will give an answer in writing. First question: there are deportations of Afghan refugees from Iran in large number. That leads to destabilization. Secondly, do you share the official Afghan view that under the cover of deportations, Iran wants to bring foreign terrorists into the country? Thirdly, what is the role given by the EU to Afghan authorities to resolve the question of refugees from Iran in order to be able to provide humanitarian aid? Thank you. Mr. Griffin, for 1.5 minutes.
This report demolishes the lies of the British political class about the Afghan war. I don't know the names of any of the innocent Afghan victims of this wicked war, but I do know that it has nothing to do with British interests. And I know the names of the 18 brave young men from my constituency who paid with their lives for this madness in the last year alone. Corporal Simon Hornby, Liverpool; Warrant Officer David Markland, Lancashire; Kingsman Sean Dawson, Stalybridge; Corporal Harvey Holmes, Hyde; Corporal Terry Webster, Chester; Lance Corporal Andrew Breeze, Manchester; Marine Stephen Birdsall, Warrington; Marine Paul Warren, Preston; Sergeant Stephen Derbyshire, Wigan; Private Alex Isaac, Wirral; Private Douglas Halliday, Wallasey; Colour Sergeant Martin Horton, Runcorn; Private Thomas Sefton, Warrington; Sergeant David Monkhouse, Cumbria; Sapper Darren Foster, Carlisle; Lance Corporal Jordan Bancroft, Burnley; Kingsman Darren Deedy, Bolton; Guardsman Christopher Davis, St Helens. What a criminal waste of brave young lives. It is, of course, no business of the European Union what wars Britain should or should not fight. That's for the British people and our elected representatives in our House of Parliament in Westminster to decide. Just as it will be for us to decide one happy day to put Messrs Blair, Brown and Cameron on trial for war crimes, because Afghanistan, just like Iraq, is a criminal war. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Griffin. We'll continue with the other speakers. Mr. MAURO, first of all, for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam President. I agree with the rapporteur insofar as there are enormous problems in Afghanistan now, and that we need to have a different approach. We need to redefine, in other words, the priorities that we've had to date. I also share his pleasure that the Afghan President Karzai has said that by 2014 only Afghan security forces will be engaged in military operations in the various provinces. The Afghan Authority has also said that it will take over security operations, but that doesn't mean that we're giving up on Afghanistan and the international community. Collaboration with Afghanistan needs to be beefed up across the board. We need to promote investments in the economy, because that will be about investing genuinely in the stability of the country. We need to do that in the right way. We need to have a genuine dialogue, inclusive dialogue involving local institutions. But the key point, as the report rightly says, is that we can't have peace and stability in Afghanistan unless the citizens can be sure that they're secure, that they can actually exercise their responsibility. And as such, I'd urge the rapporteur to rethink something, perhaps through an oral amendment. There's one passage where he talks about the use of drones on the ground as part of an operation. Now, he says, for example, it's prohibited to use the drones, but you could say let's limit as far as possible this technological tool so that we don't strike the civilian population. I'm sure that we can come together. I know that the rapporteur is sensitive to this. I know he can do this, and if he can do it, we'll support him.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mauro. Now, Mr. Vigenin for a minute and a half. Madam President, Madam Ashton, colleagues, today we're talking about one of the most important problems in 2010 in terms of foreign policy. I'll take this opportunity to express my satisfaction with the report. The data that we have on more infant mortality, less health, are facts, and 1 week of military spending costs 6 schools. Since 2009, the European Union and the member states have spent more than 8 billion euros without any results in this country. The choice is to train Afghan policemen, but 1/5 of them are drug users, and many of them are illiterate. We have to find a new strategy, being aware of the problems. The only solution is a political one, bringing in the residents, the institutions, searching for a long-term solution, and ending the production of drugs. Mr. Haglund.
Madam President, first of all, thank you to Mr. ARLACCHI. He did really good work with this strategy, and I think it also shows what kind of challenges we face, but also the mistakes that have been made here too. And I hope we're going to draw some good conclusions as to the lessons to be drawn and what we have to do vis-à-vis Afghanistan and efforts there. Now, there is a radical but important thought regarding whether or not we should have serious discussions with so-called moderate Talibans. This is probably the only way forward, although it's very difficult sometimes to define what a real moderate Taliban is, and that's a discussion we also have to have, because it's not really clear in our minds yet. Another issue concerns aid money. And what we're going to do to be able to help the Afghans in their budget in the future. We've got to think about that too. And we've also got to think about our voters back home, that we're putting all this together, but we've got to think about the abuse of aid money as well and be careful about that. Now, as regards Pakistan's role, I think that's critical. And I think the international community has an important role to play when it comes to bringing pressure to bear on Pakistan, and what Pakistan should do is important. Now, as regards my country, the discussion about Afghanistan at the moment is really only about whether Finnish troops are going to be there, where they're going to be, and so on. And also in the neighbouring country, Sweden, we've seen an interesting initiative come to the light too, but I think all of these things have to be discussed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Haglund. Now, for 1 minute, Mr. Czarnecki.
4 lata temu
Madam President, 4 years ago I was an observer in the Palestinian autonomy area, authority area, and I remember what we were thinking in the European Parliament. One representative said to me, I quote, "Those people from Hamas, they are nice, cultured people. Perhaps it's worth negotiating with them." And today it seems like déjà vu. Today I hear that it is worthwhile negotiating with moderate Taliban. But who is a moderate Taliban? And is this notion a well-defined one? I would urge to caution. It is true that many soldiers die in Afghanistan, too many also from Poland. It is true that our strategy is very costly indeed, and the NATO strategy is also ambiguous. I do tell you that we should be cautious.
Thank you, Mr. Czarnecki. Mr. Juvin, for 2 minutes now.
Monsieur Juvin.
Madame la Présidente.
Madam President, I know that Mr. ARLACCHI knows Afghanistan very well. Among the members of this assembly, he's probably the real expert on what's a complex region. But let's be clear here. The text as it stands really poses a serious issue. And I won't echo all the colleagues who have congratulated him on his text and said how delighted they are. Why is that? Well, I think what's clear in the text is that it points the finger at the West for the ills that Afghanistan is suffering from. 3 examples. Firstly, Mr. ARLACCHI writes that the health conditions have got worse since we've been there. Well, that's striking. Mrs. Ashton actually said the opposite. Did anyone notice that? Secondly, in recital B, please go ahead and read it. It says that the Western forces are occupying forces. Occupying forces. Now, members of the Parliament who know what an occupation is will judge whether that's appropriate. And then thirdly, in 71, this drone issue. Now, colleagues, I was an officer in Afghanistan 2 years ago as a medical doctor. I looked after British, German, Polish, French, Afghan soldiers, and even the Taliban. But I can say that if we say to our troops that you can't use drones, that means that you're basically saying go into direct contact with the enemy, take risks. Now, I'm not sure that it's for us as politicians to go and say that to our troops. Now, I know that it's complex, I know that war is cruel, but I think we should stop this anti-militarism, this anti-Americanism, this self-flagellation among the Western forces, claiming that Western forces are responsible for all the ills in Afghanistan. Colleagues, I think things are a lot more straightforward. The foe here is the Taliban. It's not the Americans, it's not the Western forces. It's very complex stuff, but let's be careful about how we frame this.
Thank you, Mr. Juvin. Now, Mr. Berman, for 1 minute.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Lady Ashton, I join you in your tribute to Ryszard Holbrooke. I admired him for Dayton, met him once for a fascinating dinner in Brussels and was very much impressed by him. En nu verder in het Nederlands. Een strategie die vooral militair van aard is, kan niet succesvol.
Now in Dutch. A military strategy can't succeed in Afghanistan. From 20,000 in 2001 and 150,000 now, insecurity has grown. There are more civilian victims, there are more dead soldiers. Mr. Juvin, the coalition is seen more as a occupying force. We must base ourselves on health, women's rights, local development, together with the institutions. There are nice words about fighting corruption, but nothing is really happening when it comes to corruption. When it comes to the president, that disillusions Afghans. Fighting corruption must be beefed up. Afghanistan won't make progress without a reliable administration and government.
Madam President, we cannot create a well-functioning aid program for Afghanistan without internal stability in this country. The main pillar of this activity should be security and victory over the insurgents. So that is why we should increase our engagement within NATO and to increase the strength of Europol. What we also have to do is to cut off the Taliban from its bases in Peshawar, for example. We can see that the money for financing the terrorist activities comes from drug dealing, and we have to increase our efforts trying to convince people to stop farming poppy and start farming something else. As General Petraeus has said, the financial means should be won regionally, however the authority should be a central one.
Thank you. Now, Mrs. Giannakou.
2 minutes.
2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam President. The situation in Afghanistan has raised a lot of interest in the international community, and not just because there are military forces there, but also because there are huge risks of terrorist attacks that can cause problems for the international community. Now, what's true, and we should recognize this, acknowledge this, is that since the 14th century, fundamentalist forces existed in Afghanistan. So it's important, I think, Lady Ashton, to look at the Commission's report on the situation, drug situation in Afghanistan, because that report 4 years ago actually made some predictions about Afghanistan. These predictions came true, unfortunately. Everything we've tried to do has failed. Opium in Afghanistan, which according to the specialists is the best opium in terms of its quality, manages to finance all terrorist activities in Afghanistan and in Pakistan. So we've got to do away with these practices, drug trafficking practices, but you also have to do more to develop the development sector, think about health, infant health as well, and come up with a model that will be able to be reappropriated by the Afghan people themselves and help them and improve their living conditions. Now, such a model for development, once conceived, could also help women develop their own skills, because the situation is incredibly serious for women as a result of the Taliban regime. Already in Muslim countries, women are suffering from terrible oppression, but in Afghanistan the situation is even worse. So, Lady Ashton, the European Union has to remain present in Afghanistan, and it's got to be visible. Thank you.
Mrs. Gomes, 1 minute.
Holbrooke, a quem presto também sentida homenagem, disse mesmo antes de morrer.
Richard Holbrooke said the war in Afghanistan must be stopped. Shortly before his death, he said that. And that's important for our common security. That's why We must correct the mistakes. We must make every effort on Afghanistan. That means we have the responsibility to protect the people there. We need the rule of law, democratic institutions, but that can't be run by corrupt warlords. Of course, we need democratic control of the government. We mustn't forget that there are nuclear powers in this region, and just putting our head in the sand on important political issues is not on. That wouldn't help to end the war in Afghanistan and end the hell.
Thank you. Mr. Fidanza, 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam President. I would also like to echo the condolences with regard to Mr. Holbrooke. Now, for our group, we'd have liked to have seen a very different approach from the one that Mr. ARLACCHI followed. I would like to thank him, though, for his passion on the Afghan issue. This is a report that, thanks to the various amendments tabled by our political group, is a bit less ideological. We can acknowledge some of the criticism that can be expressed, but also we've tried to set out the route forward so that we can actually guarantee sovereignty for the Afghan authorities. Now, it's true that a military response alone is not enough, but we need to stress once again that over recent months we have seen significant military successes. Take the operations in Kandahar and Helmand, but also we've seen a greater effectiveness against insurgents. That's a key premise if we're actually to try to get the Taliban around the negotiating table. This military commitment and the sacrifice of thousands of young soldiers in the ISAF contingent, including Europeans, including boys from my own country, is something that we should be proud of. It's not just a military commitment, it's a commitment for reconstruction. In that unfortunate land, we have delivered schools, bridges, civilian infrastructure that help to develop there. Therefore, despite the compromises we've achieved, there are still some areas that need improvement, particularly the point stressed before in terms of the use of drones. Now, I think it's a real mistake to deprive ourselves of the possibility of using this tool, which is very, very useful, particularly in certain areas in the northeast of Afghanistan where it's very difficult to really defeat the Taliban militias. So I think here the rapporteur can go away and rethink this. Otherwise, my group will have to vote against this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fidanza. Now the floor goes to Mr. Thaler for 1 minute.
Hvala, gospa predsednica.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Lady Ashton, I would like to congratulate Mr. ARLACCHI for this bold report. Today, we remember Mr. Holbrooke. We think about what he did in the Balkans. I'd like to quote him when it comes to the money.
I have seen in and out of government. Konec citata. Spoštovanega diplomata Holbrooka.
So, that was the end of the quotation by Mr. Holbrooke. I don't have the time to explain why we fell into the Bush trap, but people expect of us that we put an end to this war. This war has cost us too many human lives and resources. It's now time to put an end to it. That's what citizens expect of us. They expect a political solution and they don't believe in a military solution.
Thank you, Mr. Thaler. Ms. Băsescu, 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm very pleased that in the AFET committee we managed to achieve an agreement across the groups. The new text is a lot more compelling and convincing than the original text. The situation in Afghanistan, of course, needs further improvement, including after 9 years of deployment. The social indicators and the security situation have not really improved, and decisions have often been taken without the involvement of the Afghan side. So I think what's lacking in Afghanistan is not really the framework per se or the instruments. What we need is a strategic view which is in line with our commitment in Afghanistan. The European Union should work with NATO to take up the lead on the various international efforts to support Afghanistan as a sovereign state. The only political and diplomatic solution is a solution that involves the Afghan government fully. And as such, I think one of the key elements of the report is the support of the new counterinsurgency strategy. The NATO summit in Lisbon has decided to work towards a transition period where gradually security responsibilities will be passed to the Afghan side so that they have full responsibility by 2014. Now, my country will not withdraw its troops until there is security in the country. Here I would like to focus on the Russian contribution, which has helped troop movements and guaranteed supplies for our troops. Let me also say, to conclude, that in line with this handover period, the ISAF troops in the areas regarded as secure need to move to other crisis areas. That is important for the Romanian troops that are stationed in the south of the country. The region will remain unstable even if ISAF has achieved success.
Thank you very much, Ms. Băsescu. Mr. Preda, 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam President. First of all, I'd like to underline that I fully agree with what Mr. Juvin just said. And first of all, I regret the fact that the title of this report doesn't mention the European Union. I don't think we can speak on behalf of the world community, but only on behalf of the EU. I've tried to underline that in my amendments. That doesn't mean that we can't work together with our allies, as Mr. Juvin said, with the US. I think we shouldn't concentrate on a fully new strategy. I think it would be better if we could implement the strategy that we agreed at the NATO summit in Bucharest 2 years ago. So we don't necessarily need an all-new strategy. We need a coherence in the old strategy. But of course, we must learn from the mistakes that we've made. I'm thinking, of course, of the military coalition, but we shouldn't fall in the trap of idealizing the situation before the operation. As colleagues said, the removal of the Taliban was the main goal of our strategy in Afghanistan. But we should focus on the strengths of the operation, in particular the Betrayers Plan. Afghanistan is a country in which women have more rights, in which more children are going to schools, there are more factories operating, more roads being built, and that's because we've made a contribution in this country. For example, further education programs, fighting poverty, reconstruction and development. These are very important points for securing peace in Afghanistan. I would like to underline how important a pragmatic approach is. We shouldn't forget that there are over 400 amendments to this report.
Thank you very much, Mr. Preda. We're now going to move on to the Catch the Eye procedure. 6 colleagues is the maximum number of colleagues I can give the floor to, because we're already running significantly behind. So you'll have 1 minute each to take the floor, and these are colleagues from different political groups. Mr. Collino is the first speaker. Apparently he's not in the chamber. No? Very well. We'll move on to the next one. Mrs. de SARNEZ, please. 1 minute.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Very briefly, 3 things. First of all, Contrary to what's been said, I believe that the European Union should have its own strategy in Afghanistan. We have troops on the ground, military officers, they're committed, we have plenty of means, resources, and it's very important for us to have our own line of thought on this. Secondly, I believe that we really need to ensure that money from the international community goes to the benefit of the Afghan people. That's not the case. It hasn't been for 10 years. Every day we notice this in the field. I think part of that responsibility is perhaps lying with NGOs and humanitarian organisations, but unfortunately this is also due to government corruption. The rapporteur didn't really recognise this. This is a government which is corrupt and inefficient. It has to be recognised. Thirdly, political dialogue is an issue that is very important. We've been trying to deal with the Taliban and discuss things with them for some time. It hasn't really worked. But I think it's important, even though it's difficult, because having a dialogue with them, even though we're in a weak position, is going to be extremely complex. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mrs. de Sarnez. Mr. Collino is with us now. You have the floor, please, sir.
Gentile Presidente, onorevoli.
Madam President, colleagues, thanks to the adoption of various amendments, we can go along with the Arlacchi report and with the priorities that have been set out in the report in terms of the future development of Afghanistan, particularly a transparent regime for financial aid, focusing on the fight against the drugs trade and making sure that we roll back the international involvement. This has to be part of our strategy, which needs to be fully beefed up. We also need to stress again that we need to guarantee the stabilization of the territory so that the Taliban is weakened. This should give new life to the peace process, and for the EPP group, I think this will make it a text that we can go along with, and we need to pay tribute to the sacrifice of troops who are working in the ISF, who are working towards freedom and peace for the local population.
Thank you very much. You were very brief, dear colleagues. Excellent. Mrs. Neveďalová, please.
Colleagues, I think that any war brings prosperity. Some of our colleagues have problems with whether we ought to support drones. I'm not an expert. I don't think that helps. So we should concentrate on what Mr. Arlacchi mentioned, which is the situation of women and children in this country. The discrimination of women needs to be combated. Many children in Afghanistan don't have a chance to go to school and are living under the poverty threshold. If we don't support the health and education system, we won't make any progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Brons, please.
Thank you. Mr. Arlacchi's report is well researched and informative. My slight criticism is that he seems to bemoan the fact that Afghanistan is not a liberal democracy run by a coalition of Greens and Liberal Democrats in Brighton. The horror story of Afghanistan has involved the deaths of 346 British soldiers, many more Allied soldiers and thousands of innocent Afghans. During that period, infant mortality and maternal mortality have soared and life expectancy has fallen. He tells us that in 2001 no poppies were being grown in Afghanistan, whereas after 9 years of conflict and Allied influence, Afghanistan now supplies more than 90% of the heroin in Europe. To point out that there's some discrimination against women is to get things slightly out of proportion. The answer is to support our troops by stopping the war and bring them home, to guard our own people against homegrown but imported terrorists. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Nicolai, please.
Thank you, Madam President. Unquestionably, women and children are key parts of the report. But another important part of the Arlacchi report is the legitimacy of the report. We need to have legitimacy for our deployment in Afghanistan. And then we need to think about the effectiveness of our presence there. And there are question marks, frankly. and we need to find out why things are going wrong. After a decade of operations, of course, you can question the political effectiveness of the mission, and all of us have some responsibility for this. We all actually need to be able to answer questions from our voters, and I welcome this report because this report is honest. It says things that we often avoid saying, and I think the report is just one of many that we'll need to write. We need, on a periodic basis, to assess the situation, and if we find mistakes, we need to try to suggest solutions. That's what the democracy is all about.
Thank you very much. Mr. Paška, please.
Ďakujem za slovo, vážená pani predsedajúca, vážená pani...
Thank you very much, Madam President. Lady Ashton. We know from experience that helping with an intervention from the outside, one can help if the people ask for it. Now, after all the years, the population doesn't understand our intervention. I'm not trying to say that we can't help Afghanistan, but we shouldn't use force in providing aid. We ought to consider how we can provide aid so that the Afghan population receive it. I think we ought to involve local politicians and administration, and then they'll understand us. Presumably then they will be prepared to accept our help. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Last speaker, Mr. Pascu, please.
Yes. Our commitment to a stable, self-governing Afghanistan capable to prevent the re-establishment of a terrorist sanctuary there is strong and long time, being reasserted by both the EU and NATO. However, exactly because our commitment is a long-time one, I would foresee at least three major challenges. The first is that the kind of state model we provide Afghanistan with does not fit Afghan tradition. As the Afghans have to adjust, we would have to, helping them get an achievable state model, combining modernity with the Afghan tradition. The second challenge is that the security situation might well continue to require our international military involvement beyond 2014, when the Afghans will take over. We should be ready to seriously contemplate either extending that deadline or face the consequences. Finally, the third challenge will be provided by the running out of our public's patience, which might force us to speed up our present timetable to avoid the alternative of simply declaring victory and going home. That would ruin our credibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've finished now with the Catch the Eye procedure, so I'd like to pass the floor to Lady Ashton.
Thank you, Madam President. I'll just pick up, if I may, a couple of concluding remarks. First of all, to thank the European Parliament. This has been an interesting and diverse debate, and I commend you for the continued interest and energy that you put into our engagement in Afghanistan, and that's been very well demonstrated by the discussion today. As I said at the beginning, I believe Afghanistan is important for all of us and for our citizens, and that the European Union must rightly remain a key player. I hope that I spelt out at the beginning the priorities and the plans for the period ahead, and the recognition of the balance that needs to be struck between channelling resources through the Afghan government and recognising the importance of ensuring that we battle corruption appropriately to safeguard the resources that we have. We remain engaged in key sectors, in health, as I've described, in police, in justice, in rural development and in the subnational governance, and of course the rule of law is essential. Moreover, a focus, as I've described, to all these programmes is to ensure that we build up the capacity in the local Afghan structures, and that the government's priorities in combating the drugs industry and reducing corruption continue to be fully addressed. I also pointed out in my speech the importance of engaging and involving women at all levels of Afghan society and indeed in the political structures. I took note of Mr Stevens and your report and agree that water and irrigation, as in so many parts of the world, is increasingly an issue. And Mr Belder, I promise I will reply back to you as you specifically asked if I would in writing. I conclude by thanking again Mr ARLACCHI for the report. I look forward very much to continuing the discussion on the key points that issue in that report and beyond. And I end by echoing what was said about Ambassador Holbrooke, Richard, and his final words as he went into his last surgery, being on Afghanistan. That's very typical of him and how much I will miss him.
Thank you very much. Mr ARLACCHI, you have the floor, please. Just to wind up the debate, please.
Thank you very much. It has been an extremely interesting and live debate. I want just to make a couple of observations. The first is I am very happy that no criticism has been raised by anyone on the 4 main points of the report. The report asks for a reform of international aid, elimination of opium poppy cultivation, a better coordination of police training, and support to the peace process. All observations have been on other issues, and I am happy that after 1 year of discussion in the Committee on Foreign Affairs, colleagues confirmed their support to the structure of the report, which is not the ARLACCHI report. After it has been approved by the Committee on Foreign Affairs, this is the report of the committee that has been approved almost unanimously with 60 votes against 1 vote against, and has been built with the several compromises agreed upon by all political groups. So it is very important also to refer to the real text of the report, which is the last one. And no, this is for Mr Juvin. There is no mention of occupying forces in Afghanistan. This was the original text. The final text is coalition of international forces in place in Afghanistan. This part of the report has been changed by the amendments. The most important issue is drones. I mean, this is not a report on drones. These are just 2 lines of a compromise between the different political groups on the issue of the use of drones. And I believe that an agreement could have been reached already on that. But I trust my interlocutors and all the different positions, and I trust the compromise we reach. There is no call in the report for an extensive use, for a prohibition of use of drones. There is a moderate criticism about it, but I believe that an agreement between groups can be found on that. So I thank you very much, and I also thank Mrs Ashton. I hope she will take in fully account the content of the report, which is a very concrete one and calls for an exit strategy from Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rapporteur. Would you be prepared to accept a question from Mr Szegedi? Mr Szegedi would like to put a question to you, Rapporteur. He waved his blue card. Yes, the response is yes. Okay, you can put your question, Mr Szegedi. You can put your question now to the Rapporteur, please, but very briefly, please.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm not addressing my question to Mr ARLACCHI, I'm addressing my question to you, Madam President. Just a word of warning or a question. I'm an independent MEP. We don't get too much opportunities, too many opportunities to contribute to the debate. I came an hour early. I went down to your staff indicating that I would like to speak. I understand, of course, that today I didn't get the opportunity. Of course, I'm going to submit my speech in writing, which is going to be attached to the verbatim report, but it would be nicer, I expect you to have more, to be nicer towards the non-inscrits, the independent, non-attached members who get very little opportunity and speaking time.
Point d'ordre. Mr. Danjean, a point of order. Well, just to correct what's been said, Mr. ARLACCHI is right. The final text that is proposed in the recital B only doesn't have the words occupying forces, but in fact the last French version this morning still had the terms occupying forces, which is why Mr. Juvin made the statement he made earlier. Mr. Danjean, that wasn't a point of order, was it? I'm sorry, but it wasn't. Right. Now we're getting things a bit confused here. Mr. Danjean has spoken, but it wasn't actually a point of order. And Mr. Szegedi waved his blue card. But, dear colleagues, please remember that the blue card, if you wave that card, it means that you want to put a question to the previous speaker. And in response to Mr. Szegedi, I kept a close eye on the priority list regarding the names for requests for the floor, and I was only able to give the floor to 6 people. So please don't raise your blue card if you don't want to put a question directly to the previous speaker, because that's what it's supposed to be used for. So there we go. We concluded that debate now. It was very interesting, but it's over, and there will be a vote tomorrow at midday. Now, on the next item on the agenda, it's the statement by the Vice President of the Commission, High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, on the outcome of the NATO summit in Lisbon. Vice President, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. The NATO summit in Lisbon was a success for NATO and indeed for its Secretary General, and I was very pleased to have participated in some of its discussions. I will outline to honourable members what I think are the important results achieved, focusing particularly on EU-NATO relations, and I won't touch on the more internal NATO issues. In Lisbon, heads of state and government agreed on a new strategic concept, a vision for the alliance for the next 10 years. NATO preserved its core tasks of collective defence and deterrence and recognised the importance of crisis management and cooperative security. Lisbon also paved the way for important decisions for NATO in a number of key areas, such as missile defence, cyber defence, NATO reform and NATO's contribution to stabilisation and reconstruction. In relation to Afghanistan, which we just discussed and which is also an important area of cooperation between the EU and NATO, decisions were taken on both transition and on long-term partnership. I am going to focus on how Lisbon will improve, in my view, EU-NATO relations. This was also on the agenda of the Defence Ministers' meeting, which I chaired last week, which was also attended by NATO Secretary-General Anders Rasmussen. NATO is a key strategic partner for the European Union. I welcome the recognition by NATO heads of state and government of the important contribution the European Union brings to security and stability. I would like to underline the strong political commitment to the strengthening of EU-NATO strategic partnership expressed by all, especially from President Obama. I have been very actively engaged with Member States and allies and the NATO Secretary-General in order to reinforce EU-NATO relations. My participation in several NATO high-level meetings, including the Foreign Affairs dinner at the NATO Lisbon Summit, which also focused on EU-NATO relations, has been instrumental in this regard. Earlier this year, I took the initiative of sending NATO a set of concrete measures to reinforce EU-NATO cooperation. Many of these measures have already been implemented in the European Union with the support of the Secretary-General of NATO. This generated opportunities for informal discussions on issues of common interest, as well as more EU political dialogue with all NATO allies. My ambition is to pave the way to even more progress. I received a mandate for that at the 16th of September European Council. In Lisbon, Secretary-General Rasmussen received a similar mandate to work with me on reinforcing EU-NATO relations. One area of progress is EU-NATO cooperation on capability development. an area where we are achieving promising results, particularly on the military capability development, which is necessary for both enhancing military capabilities and maximising cost effectiveness. More than ever, we have to ensure complementarity and avoid duplication. On the 9th of December, EU Ministers of Defence warmly welcomed the progress that had been achieved in strengthening cooperation with NATO. We have already worked together, for example, on helicopter availability, and we have now defined the building blocks on counter-improvised explosive devices and medical support. These are both vitally important areas of work, with real operational consequences for our troops serving in the field. Just to give a couple of concrete examples. In the field of helicopters availability, we have already had 2 exercises in France and in Spain. Similar exercises are planned for the next 4 years.